So we're going to spend the next few moments talking about attracting capital and talent for an early stage MedTech company. And for our purposes, it'll be a company somewhere in the pre-seed or seed stage um, of their life. And because that's the world that I live in as a venture partner at Wavemaker 360 Health. And I've been fortunate enough to spend a fair amount of time in this space. So it'll be good. Uh, we will have some questions at the end of the presentation. We'll also have a couple polls. Emily has been kind enough to be willing to facilitate some polls. We'll do a couple polls, and then I believe I'll have a conversation with Karen with some questions that she thinks will be important for this audience. So let's dive in. I've been in the medical device space for 19 years, split between the government and the private sector. And in my current role as a venture partner, I help source, diligence, negotiate terms for investing in early stage medical device and digital health and diagnostic companies. There's a team of us that focus on traditional medtech and diagnostics, and I'm fortunate enough to lead that team. And typically, these are companies raising between $1 to $3 million and have valuations south of $10 million. Sometimes it's in the teens. Sometimes it's less than 5 million. But generally speaking, that's the valuation. And once we make the investment, we have several programs to support companies to help them either get to that FDA milestone or get their first million in sales by making strategic introductions. The fund can do that because we have over 100 LPs, investors in our fund, and most of those LPs are clinicians or healthcare executives who are active so that they may take a board seat, they may help us diligence a company, they may make strategic introductions. We just had a 90-minute session with a company that we invested in with healthcare executives to help the company refine their value proposition and go-to-market sales approach for hospital systems. I worked at the FDA for over 10 years and I evaluated over 1,000 medical device applications, and that has become my domain expertise. And I've been able to see a range of specialties from cardiovascular to now I spent a lot of time working in digital health solutions, and worked as a vice president at Danaher, which is a Fortune 150 company. And I was fortunate enough to join Jennifer McCaney at UCLA in instructing a course in MedTech innovation. So we're going to talk about the fundamentals for any early stage company. And this audience, I believe, is mainly high growth companies. So we're going to talk about the fundamentals for those that may seek venture capital, those sources of capital in the early days, and the basic playbook that I've seen time and time again that I think if you can take a nugget or two from it, I think it will be of value. We'll talk about attracting talent. And this is assuming that you have a team of 1, 2, maybe 5 employees, and you're looking to get to that next group of talent. And then we'll focus on some key questions, do a couple polls. Maybe we'll do a poll in the middle, who knows? And then we'll handle a couple questions from Karen. And by that time, it'll be dinner time. So the table stakes for a medical device company that is at a pre-seed stage, definitely a seed stage where they're talking to savvy investors beyond family, friends, and some people say family, friends, and fools, beyond those first few investors that help you raise that, say, first $250,000 or $300,000. They're going to want to see an executive summary. And there are plenty of templates on the web, but it summarizes the story of the problem you're trying to solve, your solution, why your team is uniquely positioned to solve that problem, and other key pieces of information like the regulatory path, the reimbursement path, strategy, etc. But this is something that you're going to often send as you're attracting investors, whether it be family offices, ultra high net worth individuals, or maybe even angel groups. Next, an investor presentation. This could be as brief as 10 pages, 10 slides, and there are plenty of templates on the web. Some may be slightly tweaked for MedTech. And if you go to a website like Tech Coast Angels, I still believe they have publicly available templates. Oh, and SBDC, Julie, I'm sure they have a wealth of tools to help you. Probably even if you're not formally in the program. In a data room, that data room is an environment with some level of security that you can provide access to potential investors. And in the beginning, it may be lightly populated with the record that you apply for your patents, your investor presentation, the resume of key employees. And in the beginning, it may be just 2 resumes, but that will grow over time. And again, there are general structures for how you organize data rooms, and you can Google that to find out what should be in there. But you can't really start in earnest without at least an investor presentation, but ideally these items that I talked about. And then how do you start? Fundamentally, the old cliche is true. You work with what you have and start where you are. And for most of us, we don't have a rich uncle. So the most immediate people you can reach out to are friends and family, uh, accelerators, top tier accelerators like the one Julie leads, uh, and particularly ones that have a high density of medtech companies are better than sometimes they are better than the name brand accelerators that you may have read about because they can provide you access to advisors, informal that may become formal advisors, service providers, and the wraparound community that you need to get from milestone to milestone. Ultra high net worth individuals, who are these people? These are your second cousin who's a dentist, or your third cousin who's a radiologist. And I picked these specialties on purpose because these are specialties with disposable income. You're not going to necessarily go to a family doctor quite candidly because this is just Googleable. They don't have as much disposable income as an orthopedic surgeon who fancies him or herself as fairly smart and wanting to probably scratch an entrepreneurial bug. When I was helping to raise the fund for Wavemaker, Fund One, the first place I went was to my alma mater. I graduated from the University of Virginia, the business school, and that was the first note I sent to. And my first investment came from a business school classmate. But if you don't remember anything else, and this is something that I don't think is talked about enough, fundamentally what you need is time. Time where you're 100% devoted to this endeavor over months and sometimes over a year to raise that first round of capital. And this isn't just me speaking. The research will indicates that for first-time founders raising their first seed round, it will take somewhere between 12 to 18 months to get that amount of capital put together. Oh, we'll talk about it in sources of capital. So consistently, when we meet with companies at Wavemaker, at least 50% of the medtech companies have raised or received NIH, NSF, or DoD grants. And I'm being very specific because there are other sources of non-dilutive capital, and the attempts may be multiple, need to be multiple to get these grants. The success rate for the first time applier to an SBIR grant is less than 50%. But upon multiple attempts, a company can receive these monies, and it can start anywhere from $100,000 to millions of dollars, up to $2 to $5 million in grants. But the reality is, to hone your story, which is important, and get critical feedback to get you ready for conversations with angels and institutional investors, and sometimes even savvy ultra high net worth individuals. Most people are on the pitch competition circuit, just like the one we just heard about from Julie's organization. And ULP, I'm sure, has resources to provide you information about pitch competitions. Um, on the low end, the awards will be 7K. On the high end, they could be upwards of 250K. A couple accelerators and pitch competitions that I'm aware of: Health Tech Arkansas, which guarantees a paid pilot and provides $75,000 in capital for a piece of equity. And by the way, you don't have to live in Arkansas to participate in an accelerator. MedTech Innovator is another one. MedTech Color has a pitch competition where we awarded $100,000 in non-dilutive capital. But generally speaking, if you don't have a rich uncle, you're pitching. And let me give a sense of how much you're pitching, how many people you're touching to raise money. And this sometimes will give people pause, but in my estimation, you should be and will pitch over 100 entities in order to raise that first round of capital. And this will be ideally in the fall, in the spring, and for institutional investors, the summer, things start to lax off. Even for pitch competitions, things start to wane in the summer. More recently, accelerators have raised funds. Sometimes the fund is $1 million, $2 million, maybe even $3 million. And in addition to in addition to entering the accelerator, they will make an investment in your company or some group of members of that accelerator. And many of them are well known after a quick Google search. And angels have recently started to raise funds. Similar concept where you may get 100K in investments from individual angels, and the angel fund may invest anywhere between $100,000 to $250,000 in your company through a separate application process. I didn't mention crowdfunding. That's another viable source of capital. And the raises can be anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million, depending on the story, the needs of the company. And there are many crowdfunding platforms, and the raise can be dilutive or non-dilutive. So after research, you should pick the one that's the best fit for you. And Emily, if you feel like we're running long, please feel free to, I can't see or message anything, so please feel free to just jump in and let me know that we need to wrap it up.
Okay, will do.
I appreciate you. Thank you very much. The playbook. The more organized you are in this sales process, the more successful you will be. And there's a certain level of persistence that I've seen as successful. And the persistence goes something like this. It can be an introduction. Well, the first step is, Joe Blow, can you introduce me to investor X? Joe Blow says yes. The introduction is made. The CEO follows up with the pitch deck and asks for a meeting. And the polite persistence is, after 1 to 2 weeks, a follow-up. And if there's no response, maybe one more follow-up. And the best follow-ups are with meaningful information, compelling information. Like, we just collected our proof of concept data on non-humans, or we just finished our prototype and had a great conversation with J Labs, and we're considering joining, or we joined J Labs, or we finished our prototype, or we finished our GLP study in animals, Or we just finished raising our friends and family round of $400,000, and that's going to help us build out our working prototype. Those nuggets are really important to be crisp and precise with 2 to 3 bullets to engage the potential investor in a meaningful way to hopefully elicit a response. And sometimes the ask really is for money, for advice. Uh, and being clear about the type of advice, the time commitment is crucial. In my experience, even the busiest of executives, if you frame the advice very crisply and clearly, talk about what you're working on. You don't even have to go into a lot of detail because the expert is probably going to get the value of what you're working on, and asking for 30 minutes of a person's time. I think you will get a successful hit rate. The old school ask was 1 hour, but in the last 5 years, I think it's gotten down to 30 minutes of time. I've even had requests for 15 minutes. Now, 15 minutes really never really happens. It normally bleeds into half an hour, but it's smart psychologically to ask for 15 minutes, knowing that it'll go longer. And there's an old adage, you ask for advice when you want money. Um, and when you ask for money, you'll get advice. So you can think that through as you are seeking out people to talk to. And I talked about this, but this is really true. The, the two good things that you can get out of a pitch, besides money, is when you pitch, you get meaningful feedback to help you refine your story, or you stimulate that investor to think about other investors or other talent that you may need to go continue on your journey. But fundamentally, I would get my head wrapped around doing this 100 times in order to raise that first $1 million. I wrote a blog post about it, and it's based on a fair amount of research. So you may have a team of 2 right now, and know that you need a chief commercialization officer, or know you need a vice president of sales, or know you need regulatory help or reimbursement help to craft that story for that seed raise, at least a high level story. To do that, I think one of the best things you can do is engage with advisors ideally on a voluntary basis, but in a professional manner for a specific deliverable. For example, um, Kwame, I am an early stage entrepreneur building a novel pacemaker lead, and I want to confirm the regulatory path. Do you have 30 minutes for me to talk through 3 questions I have about the regulatory path that I think we're going down? And then Kwame is an advisor for the accelerator program in, so he's pretty much obligated to do it. Or he got introduced by a mutual colleague who he's known for 20 years, so he'll do it. Or you went to the same university as that person, and they have an affinity for that university, so they'll do it because of that. There are many reasons why people will give you free advice, and sometimes even engage in short-term projects. And that's an opportunity for you to get a sense for whether you would want to offer them a role as an informal advisor or a formal advisor in your company. In California, there's a wonderful accelerator program with an amazing track record, and they have a group of advisors where it's not unusual for them to advise for the 12-week period and then take on some more formal role with equity in the company. One thing I would say is that there is a potential and the danger to ask someone to be an advisor too early. And quite candidly, it happens to me. On the first meeting, at the end of the meeting, I would love for you to be an advisor. And that's, in my humble opinion, not enough time to make a decent assessment as to whether you want that person to be intimately involved in your company for months or maybe even over a year. So to de-risk that whole proposition, I encourage you, and there are matrices for this, to outline the skills you need for a board, for advisors, for the first few key hires, write it down so that you can have a more crisp, cogent conversation and be able to source people more intelligently. Now, are they just hanging out waiting to be asked? No, these are busy professionals and timing is important. You may make contact with someone, and this is very, very, very common in the investing world. There are companies that we invested in 2 years after meeting them. And for some funds, it is a written or unwritten rule that they have to get to know you over months before they would feel comfortable or they would make an investment. Same thing goes with key hires and talent. Sometimes with major universities, there is a person who informally is highly networked and has a cadre of corporate executives that they know are interested in their next or interested in an entrepreneurial endeavor. And that's a really loose and formal way of getting some talent, but that is the way it's done. And I would say, candidly, this is an inefficient, time intensive process, and you just can't go on Indeed and find the talent that you need at the price point that makes sense for you as an early stage company. But this is the way the game is played. I believe I covered everything in here. I don't have a crisp answer for how you go from a team of one to a team of 10 in 2 months. It's a process that may take multiple months, and it just takes work and requires 100% devotion and attention. All right, Emily, I think we're doing great on time. And I covered some of these, but I'll go into a little bit more detail regarding how long this will take and the talent you need early on, et cetera. So I would say the process will always take longer than one expects because you will, at a minimum, need to work with people like contract manufacturers, and in this era, may suffer delays due to supply chain issues. Um, Whatever you think is going to be an easy one call can turn out to be 2 or 3 calls with a potential advisor or service provider. And there's just a process that you have to deal with to close any type of opportunity, from applying for a phase one SBIR to interviewing contract manufacturers that are ISO 13485 certified, to finding one that you're comfortable with, to finding a law firm that you're comfortable with that has a package for early stage companies that you're comfortable with. And a lot of these major law firms have opportunities to participate with no upfront cash, but you may be more comfortable with one firm's reputation or commitment or timing of paying them on the back end as opposed to another. And there are some firms that you may go to because you know from talking to your colleagues in the ecosystem that they are a known top tier entity, a top brand. I won't name them, but there are a few that I could rattle off and you could probably rattle off, but you're going to pay for it. You're going to pay for it one way or the other. These firms bill out $1,300 an hour for partners. Or you want to brand yourself as a capital efficient, scrappy, early stage company, and you'll go to a value priced law firm with deep domain expertise in MedTech. And there are those too. And I can tell you a few names of them as well, where they don't have the overhead of a beautiful office with wood, a beautiful oak table. They work out of WeWork, but they've been doing MedTech IP for 15 years. And they'll just charge you $400 an hour as opposed to $1,000 an hour. And the talent you need early on really should be driven by your milestone. If you need a working prototype, you may just need a maker space with, at a J Labs where they have someone on staff that can help you take it from a napkin sketch to a mock-up. But if you need something that's more functional, then you need to start interviewing CDMOs. And maybe you want to go to Asia, maybe you don't. Maybe you're concerned about IP protection, maybe you're not. But it should be thoughtful. You can't spend months opining. You have to interview quickly and select and move on. But this is a type of talent you may need early on. Sales, quite candidly, is probably not a need until you're within 6 months of an FDA decision. But you may want to start identifying salespeople. You absolutely want to think about your sales force before you submit your 510K, for example. And this to me is the most important thing. It's been written up in books like The Founder's Dilemma. There have been case studies on this. I studied about this in business school, but I find this to be true time and time again. And personal runway is, how long can you survive without a paycheck? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is my spouse. And then the conversation is with your spouse, how long are we going to go on this journey without you drawing a salary? And whatever time you estimate, double it. And that is the amount of personal runway you will need. Quite candidly, at a minimum, that personal runway should be 12 months. How do you get there? You can cash out your 401k. You probably you could refinance your house. You can, and this is dramatic, but it depends on how passionate you are, potentially downsize your house to get a smaller mortgage. These are all practical ways. And the obvious way is your spouse has a stable, and this is a classic entrepreneurial profile. Your spouse has a classic, predictable income stream. They work for the government, they work for a large nonprofit, etc., so that you can accept this risk as a family. And quite candidly, it's probably a good thing that you have a spouse, ideally, that has a different risk tolerance than you, so that you can balance yourself out in this long-term journey. If you're single, the advantages are you have 100% control over the decisions you make around where you live, what you eat. Do you go to Fogo de Chow's or do you go to In-N-Out? Do you buy a 3-bedroom house or do you buy a 1-bedroom condo, etc., etc., etc.? But personal runway is not talked about a lot, but it is critical, absolutely critical. All right, Emily, I'm feeling it. Let's do some polls. Let's see what people think about these polls. We only have 2.
All right.
There's no failing this. What's the typical time it takes to raise a seed round for first-time founders? Hosts and panelists cannot vote.
Just gonna give everybody a couple seconds to vote. Okay.
Yeah, I would say it is possible to do it in 12 months. And this is let me give you a profile of someone who might be able to do this in 12 months. Undergrad, Princeton, MBA from Harvard, spent 3 years as an investment banker. Uncle is a radiologist, comes from a solidly middle upper class family, and just had an inheritance windfall. That's when you can do it in 6 to 12 months. Most people don't have that story, and it will take longer to raise that first round. All right, let's go to the next one. What are the most common ways for a first-time founder can best fund through the valley of death? And the valley of death is this term to describe a range of companies, but for me, MedTech companies that are pre-revenue, have exhausted NIH grants, but need to meet a couple milestones, get through the FDA before they can generate revenue. Yeah. So I know I kind of beat this to death. One rich uncle could get you through the valley of death, but most companies that I meet with have been pitching for several months. They've got phase 1 and phase 2 grants under their belts, and they've come out of at least one accelerator, like SBDC's accelerator, as an example. And maybe I can stop sharing so I can see your lovely faces. And we had a few questions, Karen, I think that you wanted to cover in addition to what we talked about.
We actually have a couple questions from the audience if you want to answer that first.
Oh, yes, indeed.
All right, so the first question comes from Alan. He asks, can you recommend any investors who would be a lead on a Series B and company is looking for $5 to $10 million? The product is in respiratory medical devices.
Well, yes, I can think of, if they're in revenue, I'll talk about some bigger brands that I know. One is MVM out of Boston. They invest later stage, and quite candidly, a lot of MedTech funds will invest at the B. Another one that's local and is open to a later stage investment is OCV Partners. You may be at a point where you want to look at strategic venture funds like ResMed, and trying to think. This is something where a good accelerator may have a up-to-date database of active investors. I know Scale Health in Los Angeles has an active internal ecosystem database of active investors, and those are a few that I can think of off the top of my head for your situation.
Okay, so we have a second question from Paul. He asks, rather than hires, what about contractors for clinical, regulatory, quality, testing, manufacturing, etc.?
Yeah, yes. So I think, so let me give you a real world example. Great company based in Irvine. Everybody knows them, the dental startup, the orthodontic company Embrace. So I am fortunate. I work with select companies in a consulting basis. I'll give you a real world example in regulatory, and this isn't confidential. I was fortunate enough to support them as a consultant, probably through a-ish for about a year. But there was a point, and from the very beginning, I said, you should think about this role of a regulatory lead being a full-time hire. And by this time, they were definitely either raising the Series B or close the Series B. And that was the right time for me to transition off. That is very common. Same thing for reimbursement. That can absolutely be a consultant. 9 times out of 10, it is a consultant. Clinical, it could go either way. You could have a chief medical officer who's a full-time employee, or you could have a consultant. If you're running a large clinical trial, you are going to need a consulting firm. And I can think of companies in our portfolio, they use a consulting firm. Generally speaking, when you're pre-seed and seed, most of your team is going to be consulting, small core. When you start getting A to A, some of those consultants, you're going to hire more people as consultants, but some of them some of the roles will be full-time equivalents. Like definitely by your A, you're probably thinking about hiring a VP of sales, chief commercialization officer, et cetera. So that's the way I think about it. Oh, one last thing is slightly different roles for a digital health company versus a traditional medical device company, but there's a lot of overlap. So there may be nuances in the type of people you want on your team for a digital health company versus a traditional medical device company. All right, I'm ready for another one. Do we have another one?
Yes, we have one more question from Milad. He asks, can you please elaborate on if you ask for advice, you get money. If you ask for money, you will get advice.
It's a cliche, but it's true. I would just say it's human nature. One, uh, raising capital in the conversation. Some people use the analogy of courtship and dating and getting married. It's kind of extreme. Sometimes investor relationships last longer than marriages, but it definitely is a relationship. And there's a cadence, there's unwritten rules, and the cadence and unwritten rules go something like this. First contact, you're really just expressing and trying to get an invitation to a half hour, hour long conversation where the company can get to know you. That hour long conversation ideally has enough meat, compelling IP, excellent reimbursement story, excellent regulatory story, that the company wants to go into whatever their process is for diligence. But all along that line, you're going to share what your raise is, but that's not what you lead with. You lead with, this is a compelling opportunity, and you may sprinkle in a couple of questions for advice because psychologically you're engaging that person more intimately. And it's an intimate relationship. So asking for advice nurtures a relationship that eventually will help support or encourage or tip someone over potentially to want to make an investment. Now, is anyone going to make an investment with you because they just like you? 9 times out of 10, most investors will not invest in you because they like you. And here's another dirty little secret. Some investors will say, well, I don't invest in anyone that couldn't have a beer with. That's not true. Investors are financially motivated and they will invest in a company with favorable economics where they can see scaling to $50 million in 4 to 5 years and an exit by acquisition by a strategic. That's it. If they like you, nice. If they have a beer with you, nice. I don't have a beer with the majority of the portfolio company CEOs just because first we're geographically distributed, and that's not the nature of our relationship. It is a business relationship. Now, we have dinners with our portfolio company CEOs on occasion, uh, but this is business. And so when you ask too early or too directly for money, it shows that you don't know the rhythm and the nature of these interactions. And it may cause, we're all human beings, it may cause a little bit of a pullback from that investor. Having said all that, if it's a compelling opportunity, that investor's mandate is to deploy capital in investable companies. So they will still want to engage in a conversation. It's just kind of knowing the unwritten rules of the game. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to share some of the questions that we generally get from like our residents or just the general community. So the first one is, what is your best advice on how startups can prepare for venture capital meetings?
I would say the two things that are most important for a meeting is understanding the economics of the deal. And the economics have two flavors. What is going to be your revenue over the next 4 to 5 years, period? And what is your profitability? What are the unit economics, et cetera? Now, there is a lot more to the story, but fundamentally, most investors want to know, and I will give you a very specific number for most institutional investors and to a lesser extent, angels. They want to know that 4 years from now, you'll be generating north of $25 million in revenue. That's the minimum. And they want to know for MedTech companies that at scale, your gross margins will be close to 80%. Those are kind of general rules of thumb for traditional MedTech deals. And then the believability of the team, the credibility of the team, and everyone will know that you don't have the entire team fully fleshed out, but that kernel, that core, the founder and co-founder, at a minimum, have to give the investor the sense, and generally give the investor the sense that this is an investable, compelling, charismatic company that can go the distance. And when I say charismatic, I don't mean in the soap opera manner. When I say charismatic, there's all types of charisma. it can be a PhD scientist from Duke who's been doing this for 20 years, but can effectively articulate the problem and solution. That's the type of charisma. The other is a 6 foot former quarterback, starting quarterback for Alabama. That person has a different type of charisma. Charisma is charisma, and it really is, and investors will talk about this, sending the message that that CEO, that team can not only raise this pre-seed round, seed round, but you could see that person raising an A, B, because of what they communicate, how they communicate it, and that intangible. So that's what I would say to that answer, Karen.
Okay, so we have another question from Paul. He asked, should one go for proof of concept prototype and after the first 10 patients get a real design for manufacturing device, or should one not waste that early money and go for the real device right away?
I'm not going to say it depends. I would say 6 times out of 10, get the proof of concept uh, and early data. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on 10 humans. It could potentially be on the right animal model. What you want, the milestone is literally proof of concept. It's relatively safe. We have initial data to show it's effective. And that is the minimum bar to compel someone to be able to support a raise of 1 to 3 million potentially. Now, I could envision a scenario, and let's just say that takes $500,000 to get there. If your business is such that it takes $1 million to get to a manufacturable device, then raise $1 million. So I would say that probably would be a compelling reason to skip the whole prototype proof of concept on animals and 10 patients. And if you legitimately think that you can build a whole, and this will probably be a simple class 1 type device, simple electromechanical system in a well understood disease area, then you may want to just go straight forward. But thank you. That's a very nuanced question. Thank you for that question.
Okay, let's see. We have another question. How do deals really get to VCs for consideration?
Yeah, how do they really get there? So the real answer is they can, and we have a pie chart. So we have a pie chart of where we get deals from. The majority come from these sources, other investors, quite candidly, other investors who we trust and have co-invested in. And this is a common breakdown across investors. Your current portfolio CEOs. So we have invested in women's health. So we've had other companies say, oh, we see you invested in women's health, and the smarter ones get an introduction from our current CEO into us. Organizations that we trust that have done great things for us, like Biocom. We love Biocom and we consider them partners. And they have dedicated a whole day for us to sit in front of great companies like Hydrostasis down there in San Diego. Less, but it still happens, LinkedIn, cold email. Oh, and our LPs, that's another way to get in front of us. So if you can somehow, and this is very difficult to find out, this is not public information, but if you can find out who the investors are in a fund and get a relationship or get connected to them, they would love to make introductions into the fund because it makes them look smart, and we fall in more love with our investors that way. And that is another source of deal flow for us. And I think those would be fairly common for most funds.
Okay, I think we have one final question, and it's people always say that you should tap into your network for fundraising, but for people that don't have an established network, how should they approach fundraising?
Well, we talked about it a bit, and the reality is, and I'm not, whoever posed this question, I'm not suggesting that you're trying to engage in a pity party. It's an inefficient, difficult process, and most people fail. And the only way to do it is to tap into multiplying type organizations that will greatly open your access to a wider network. And let's just say you're African American, come from a middle class family, don't have a rich uncle. You could apply for the pitch competition for MedTech Color. Let's say you're a woman-led company. There's a great I think it's called Halogen. I'm embarrassed because I have a colleague who's active in it, but there are some top tier accelerators focused on women-led companies. I guarantee you, and I'm assuming this crowd is from Southern California. If you're in Orange County, you can find a great accelerator. If you're in San Diego, oh my gosh, there must be several options. And that is the path. And in LA, I've talked about Scale Health. Um, there are some great organizations with not just one or two members, 50, 100 members, and they have these internal Slack channels, and you just pose questions. Hey, I'm looking for, a family office with a focus on respiratory health, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's how you do it. And that's why it's not a part-time. Well, let me also say that, and I didn't talk about this much. We invested in a physician-led company who over time transitioned from being a full-time clinician to being a full-time CEO. So I'm not going to say that you flip a switch, you quit your $200,000 job and take no salary for a year, but it can be a progression over time. And that's another reality of the journey for most CEOs that we don't talk about a lot.